The shape of silence. Elias did not see the world in photons and light waves. He saw it in a topographic map of vibrations, a majestic, ever-shifting landscape of acoustic geometry. To the rest of the world, Elias was a helpless, blind man, tapping his white cane with pitiful uncertainty. In reality, he was an apex predator of perception. He could hear the friction of a spider walking on the ceiling. He could discern the brand of a watch by the ticking of its gears from across a room. His brain processed the latency of sound waves bouncing off objects, painting a 3D wireframe of his surroundings that was more precise than sight ever could be. He had just moved into apartment 4B. It was a pre-war building, rich with the groans of settling timber and the hum of old copper pipes. Elias was cataloging the room. Sofa, leather, 3 meters at 2 o'clock. Bookshelf, pine, 5 meters at 10 o'clock when the anomaly occurred. A crash. A book falling in the bedroom. Elias's head snapped toward the open doorway. His ears flared, capturing the chaotic echoes of the room. He expected to hear the subtle sway of a drafty curtain or the scurry of a rat. Instead, he heard nothing, not the quiet of an empty room, but a violent, unnatural nothingness. In the upper corner of the bedroom ceiling, there was a hole in his acoustic map. The background hum of the city traffic, the buzzing of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards. Those sounds hit a specific point in the corner and simply vanished. It was a silhouette of absolute silence, a negative space cut out of reality, and it was shaped like a man, a demon, Elias realized, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The void shifted. The silence detached itself from the ceiling and dropped to the floor. There was no thud. There was only the sensation of the air being displaced, a sudden vacuum pressure that popped in Elias's ears. The entity was investigating him. Elias forced his eyes to remain unfocused, staring blankly past the entity. He tapped his cane. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called out, his voice trembling with a feigned confusion that masked a primal terror. The void moved closer. It stood inches from his face. Elias could feel the cold radiation of it, a chill that seemed to dampen the sound waves of his own breathing. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He played the part of the prey, knowing that if the predator realized he could perceive it, the game would end in blood. 3 days later, the game escalated. Elias sat on the patio of a bustling coffee shop, the air thick with the cacophony of ceramic clicking against saucers and the hiss of espresso machines. It was a blindingly bright acoustic environment, which usually delighted him. But today, the void was with him. It was standing 3 tables away. The chatter of the patrons behind it was muffled, swallowed by the humanoid shape of silence. Elias sipped his latte, his hand shaking imperceptibly. He kept his head tilted down, feigning interest in the Braille menu, while his auditory radar tracked the entity. The void drifted toward a middle-aged man in a gray suit who was laughing into his phone. Elias tracked the movement. The void placed what would be its hand on the man's chest. The reaction was instantaneous. The man didn't scream. His heart simply stopped. Elias heard the specific wet thump of the final beat, the fluid dynamics of the blood stagnating, the sudden seize of the cardiac muscle. The man slumped forward, his phone clattering to the table. Panic erupted in the cafe. "Call 911. He's not breathing." Elias sat frozen. The void was standing right there, amidst the chaos, feeding on the death. If Elias turned his head, if he showed even a micro-expression of horror directed at the invisible killer, he was dead. The void turned. Elias felt the pressure change. The entity abandoned the corpse. It glided through the screaming crowd, unaffected by the physical bodies, and stopped directly in front of Elias. It was studying him. It was wondering why the blind man hadn't reacted to the presence of death, only the sound of it. The suspicion followed him home. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. The demon was testing him now. It no longer hovered in corners. It was active, aggressive. Test 1. Elias was walking from the kitchen to the living room, a path he had memorized perfectly. He knew the layout down to the millimeter, but as he stepped forward, the acoustics changed. The void had moved the heavy oak coffee table silently, placing it directly in his path. Elias saw it with his ears. He knew it was there. He could easily step around it, but a blind man wouldn't know. He gritted his teeth and kept walking. He drove his shin straight into the sharp edge of the oak table. Gah! Elias crumbled to the floor, clutching his leg. The pain was blinding, white-hot and searing. He bit his lip until it bled, cursing loudly, dragging himself backward. "Who moved the damn table?" he shouted at the empty room. He lay there panting, tears leaking from his dead eyes. He listened. The void was standing over him. It seemed to vibrate, a low-frequency tremor of uncertainty. It wasn't convinced. Test 2. That night, Elias lay in bed, the duvet pulled up to his chin. He was exhausted, his mind fraying at the edges. The silence in the room was oppressive. Suddenly, the air pressure spiked. From the foot of the bed, the void lunged. It was a ballistic strike, a silent missile aimed directly at Elias's face. The displacement of air was so violent, it blew Elias's hair back against the pillow. Every instinct in his brain screamed, dodge, roll, protect. Elias forced his muscles to turn to stone. He kept his eyes wide, unseeing, fixed on the ceiling. He controlled his breath, forcing his heart rate to remain rhythmic, even as the predator dived at him. The attack stopped 2 inches from his nose. The void hung there, suspended in gravity-defying silence. Then, seeing no reaction, no flinch, no pupil dilation, no gasp, it released its hold on the air. It didn't land. It simply drifted to the floor like a feather, making no sound as it impacted the rug. Elias turned over in bed, groaning softly, as if disturbed by a bad dream, and pulled the blanket tighter. "I won," he thought, his internal monologue a frantic scream. "I beat it. It thinks I'm helpless." The final day began with sunshine, or at least the warmth of it on his skin. Elias was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. The rhythmic chop, chop, chop of the knife against the wooden board was soothing. The void was in the room, leaning against the refrigerator, a silent observer. Elias reached for the spice rack. His elbow knocked the heavy chef's knife off the counter. It was a fatal geometry. The knife tipped, spun once, and fell point down toward Elias's bare foot. It happened in the span of a microsecond. The whistle of the steel cutting the air. The trajectory calculation in Elias's brain. The realization that the blade would sever the tendons in his foot, crippling him, perhaps leading to infection or blood loss. The mask slipped. The survival instinct, honed by a lifetime of relying on reflexes over sight, bypassed his conscious control. His hand lashed out with viper-like speed. He snatched the knife out of the air by the handle, inches before it hit his skin. The room froze. Elias stood there, trembling, the cold steel handle gripped tight in his fist. He realized what he had done instantly. The echo of the catch, the slap of skin against plastic, rang out like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. He realized then that the demon, with its supernatural speed, would have likely caught the knife itself, or stopped it, just to see if he would react. But it was too late. The deception was shattered. Slowly, Elias turned his head. He didn't look past the demon this time. He looked directly at the void of sound standing by the refrigerator. He locked his sightless eyes onto where the entity's face would be. The silence of the room was broken. For the first time since it had arrived, the void made a sound. It was a dry, rasping noise, like sandpaper on bone. It started low and built into a crescendo. It was laughing. The laughter was the last thing Elias heard before his chest tightened, a crushing iron grip squeezing his heart until the rhythm of his life simply stopped. The Puppeteer's host. The news report was merely background radiation, a low-frequency hum of misery that accompanied their Friday night ritual. Mark sat on the worn-out beige sofa, controller in hand, while David decimated a bag of spicy chips next to him. On the television screen, a reporter with perfectly coiffed hair stood in front of a cordon of yellow tape. Authorities are baffled by the latest discovery in the Locked Room series, she said, her voice practiced and grave. 2 victims found in a 3rd-story apartment building. Preliminary forensics suggest they strangled one another simultaneously, despite the size difference between the male suspect and the elderly female victim. Simultaneously. David snorted, not looking away from the game. Physics doesn't work like that. It's got to be toxins or a cult. Mark chuckled, though a cold shiver traced the length of his spine. You think everyone is a cultist, Dave? Pass the salsa. They were the kind of friends who communicated in shorthand, a bond forged over a decade of shared stupidity and triumphs. Mark knew David's tell when he was bluffing in poker. He scratched his nose. He knew David's favorite pizza topping. He knew the exact cadence of David's laugh, which was why, 3 days later, the silence felt so loud. It started with unread messages, then missed calls. Then, David, who lived his life permanently online, went dark on every platform. By the 2nd evening, the silence had curdled into dread. Mark sat in his car outside David's apartment complex, the engine idling. The rain hammered against the windshield, distorting the streetlights into bleeding watercolors of orange and red. He's probably just depressed, Mark told himself, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Or sick. I'm overreacting. But as he killed the engine and stepped into the cold night, the reporter's voice echoed in his memory. simultaneously. Mark knocked on Unit 304. Usually David would shout a curse word or fling the door open within seconds. Today, there was only a heavy, suffocating silence. Mark knocked again, harder. "Dave, it's Mark. Open up, man." From deep within the apartment, a sound emerged. It was not the light, rhythmic patter of David's sneakers. It was a heavy, wet thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. It sounded less like walking and more like a sack of wet cement being dropped repeatedly against the floorboards. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. David stood in the sliver of light. He looked eroded. His skin, usually flush with life, was the color of old parchment, hanging loosely off his cheekbones, as if the connective tissue beneath had dissolved. Dark, bruised crescents hung heavy under his eyes, and his hair was matted with sweat. "Mark," David said. The voice was wrong. It was a flat, rasping baritone, stripped of all inflection. "You came." "Jesus, Dave," Mark breathed, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The air in the apartment was stale, thick with the metallic tang of copper and something sweet, like rotting fruit. "You look like hell. Have you slept in the last 24 hours? David closed the door. The heavy thud-thud of his steps followed Mark into the living room. "Sleep is difficult. I have felt horrible all day." Mark scanned the room. The blinds were drawn tight. The TV was unplugged. "Sit down," Mark commanded, his concern overriding his unease. "I'm making you tea. You look like you're about to collapse." David sat on the edge of the sofa. He didn't slouch. He sat with rigid, unnatural posture, his hands resting perfectly still on his knees like a doll placed on a shelf. Mark moved to the kitchenette, filling the kettle. He watched his friend from the corner of his eye. There was a stiffness to David's movements, a lag between thought and action that triggered a primal alarm in Mark's brain. "Remember when we pulled that all-nighter for the raid?" Mark asked, trying to force normalcy into the room. "You looked better then, and you'd consumed nothing but energy drinks for 2 days." David's lips twitched. The corners of his mouth pulled upward, but the rest of his face remained dead. The eyes didn't crinkle. The brow didn't furrow. It was just a contraction of muscles, a mechanical smile. "That was fun," David said monotone. "We laughed." "Yeah," Mark said slowly. The water in the kettle began to boil, a rising scream that matched the tension in his chest. "That's not him." The thought arrived fully formed. "That is not David." Mark turned off the stove. He needed to be sure. He needed to prove to his own rational mind that he wasn't going crazy. "I was thinking about Ashley on the drive over," Mark said casually, leaning against the counter. "Remember? That summer we all went to the lake house? She got so drunk she nearly burned the dock down." David's head swiveled toward him. The motion was too smooth, like a turret. "Ashley," he repeated. "Yes, she was very funny." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. Ashley didn't exist. It was a name Mark had pulled from thin air. The thing on the couch wasn't his friend. It was an imposter wearing David's skin like a cheap suit. "I need to use the bathroom," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly. "Too much coffee." "Hurry back," the thing said. "I enjoy our time." Mark walked into the hallway, entering the bathroom and locking the door with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. He braced his hands against the sink, staring at his reflection. His pupils were dilated, his skin pale. Panic creates mistakes, he told himself, channeling the tactical mindset he usually reserved for video games. Analyze the situation. Hostile entity in the living room. Capabilities unknown. It has David's mass, but moves with unnatural weight. He looked around the small room for a weapon. His eyes landed on the mop propped in the corner. It had a sturdy wooden handle. Mark grabbed it, placed it over his knee, and snapped the mop head off. It wasn't a sword, but it was a solid 4-foot staff of ash wood. A piercing weapon. "I'm getting you out of there, Dave," Mark whispered to the empty air, hoping his friend was still somewhere inside that shell. He unlocked the door. The hallway was pitch black. While Mark was in the bathroom, the entity had killed the lights. The darkness wasn't just an absence of photons. It felt physical, a viscous, suffocating ink that pressed against his eyes. "He knows I know," Mark realized. The Ashley question gave it away. Mark raised the staff, stepping slowly onto the floorboards. He remembered the layout. 3 steps to the living room archway, then the open space. He breathed through his nose, trying to keep his heart rate under control. Step, step, step. He reached the threshold of the living room. From the corner to his right, a space that should have been empty, the air displaced violently. A shape launched itself at him. It was faster than a human should be. Mark saw the glint of metal in the dark, a kitchen knife arcing toward his neck. Reflexes took over. Mark slammed the staff upward, a desperate parry. Wood met forearm. The impact was solid, but the entity didn't cry out. It merely adjusted its trajectory mid-air. The knife missed Mark's throat, but slashed deep into his right forearm. Mark gritted his teeth against the searing line of fire that erupted on his skin. He didn't retreat. He used the momentum, driving the end of the staff forward like a spear, aiming for the center of mass. The staff connected with the entity's chest. It felt like hitting a bag of sand. David was thrown backward, crashing into the coffee table. Glass shattered. The figure sprawled on the floor, limbs tangled in the wreckage. Mark stood over him, clutching his bleeding arm, the staff raised high. "What are you?" he screamed into the darkness. "Where is David?" The figure on the floor began to shake. A low, guttural sound bubbled up from its throat. It wasn't a groan of pain. It was laughter. The entity pushed itself up. It didn't use its arms. It simply levered its torso upright from the hips. A movement that defied leverage. Mark froze. Around the silhouette of his friend's body, the darkness seemed to warp. An unnatural, oily shadow was bleeding out of David's pores, enveloping him in a shroud of black mist. And then the eyes opened. They were no longer hazel. 2 burning points of crimson light, like dying stars, glowed in the gloom. "You are already mine," the voice said. It wasn't David's rasp anymore. It was a sound like grinding stones. The entity raised the knife. Mark braced himself for another lunge, tightening his grip on the staff. "Come on," he thought. "I'll take your head off." But the entity didn't lunge at Mark. With a wide, ecstatic grin that tore the corners of David's mouth, the entity reversed the grip on the knife. It looked Mark dead in the eye, savoring the horror on his face. "No," Mark shouted, realizing too late what was happening. The entity drove the blade upward, deep into its own stomach, and ripped sideways. It was a lethal, catastrophic wound. David's body convulsed once, violent and final, and then slumped to the floor, the red light in his eyes extinguishing instantly. Mark dropped the staff, falling to his knees beside his friend. He reached out, his hands hovering over the ruin of his best friend's torso. "Dave. Oh, God." The room was silent. The body was dead. Mark stared at the corpse, his mind fracturing under the weight of the trauma. It killed him. It just discarded him. He didn't notice the shadow. The oily black mist that had surrounded David didn't dissipate with death. It detached itself from the corpse, hovering in the air like a sentient cloud of smoke. Mark looked up, his eyes widening. The shadow surged. It didn't move through space. It skipped it. One moment it was hovering over the corpse. The next it was a cold, piercing pressure in the center of Mark's chest. It slammed into him with the force of a freight train. Not physical, but psychic. Mark gasped, his back arching. He tried to scream, but his vocal cords were no longer under his control. He felt his consciousness being shoved into the back seat of his own mind, a passenger in a vehicle he no longer steered. His vision blurred, then sharpened with a new, terrible clarity. The pain in his bleeding arm vanished, replaced by a dull, distant awareness of damage that was no longer his concern. Mark, or the thing that was now Mark, stood up. He looked down at the body of David, lying in a pool of dark blood. He stepped over the corpse, walking toward the hallway mirror. He examined his new face. He tested the jaw, sliding it back and forth. He blinked, watching his own reflection. This was fun, Mark said to the empty room, his voice carrying a subtle, grinding undertone. A smile spread across his face, stretching just a little too wide. "Maybe I will keep you alive longer." The calculus of zero. The world, to Arthur, was not a collection of people. It was a spreadsheet of variables, a scrolling feed of data that only he could perceive. He sat on a wrought iron bench in the center of the metro station, hands folded neatly over his briefcase, watching the morning rush. He did not see faces. He saw numbers. A businessman in a charcoal suit hurried past, checking his Rolex. Arthur's mind instantly overlaid the figure with a floating spectral tag: 12%. Impurity, greed, adultery, neglect. A teenage boy, laughing too loudly with his friends: 41%. Impurity, petty theft, deceit. Arthur sighed, a small puff of steam escaping into the chill air. The world was a filthy place. It was a tapestry of moral decay, stained by the gross incompetence of the human soul. He considered himself not a murderer, but a curator, a preservationist. When he found something rare, something pure, it was his duty to stop it from spoiling, to freeze it in time before the world rotted it from the inside out. And then he saw her. She was exiting a bakery across the concourse, brushing crumbs from a beige coat. She stopped to help an elderly woman pick up a dropped glove. It wasn't the action that caught Arthur's eye. It was the aura. The number bloomed in his mind, bright and blinding white, 88%. Arthur's breath hitched. 88. He hadn't seen a number that high in 3 years. She was a diamond in a sewer. Target acquired, his mind whispered, shifting gears from observer to calculator. Subject 24. The baker. The building had been a clinic in the 80s, then a squat for junkies, and now it was Arthur's sanctuary. It sat on the edge of the industrial district, a brick tooth amidst a line of warehouses. Arthur stood in the basement operating theater. The air here was scrubbed clean, smelling of heavy industrial bleach and the sharp metallic tang of cold iron. He was preparing. Arthur adjusted the instruments on the stainless steel tray. Scalpel, bone saw, spreader. Each tool was polished to a mirror sheen. He wiped a microscopic speck of dust from the handle of the saw with a lint-free cloth. Perfect, he whispered, the sound deadened by the soundproof foam he had lined the walls with. Clang. Arthur spun around. On the far side of the room, a heavy metal kidney dish had fallen from a secure counter, spinning noisily on the concrete floor. Arthur stared at it, his pulse not quickening, but his brow furrowing. He walked over, his footsteps silent on the rubber mats. He inspected the counter. It was level. There was no draft. Vibrations, he concluded, his internal monologue, swift and dismissive. A heavy truck passed on the highway 3 miles away. Resonant frequency. Simple physics. He picked up the dish and placed it back, deeper on the counter this time. He checked his watch. It was time to go. The baker worked the closing shift tonight. The extraction was elegant. It was a mathematical equation solved with zero remainder. The coffee shop was closing. The lights were dimmed. The baker Sarah, according to her name tag, was wiping down the espresso machine, her back to the door. Arthur entered. He wore a heavy woolen coat and a flat cap pulled low, a medical mask covering his lower face. To the cameras, he was a smudge of pixels. To Sarah, he was just a rude, late customer. "I'm so sorry, sir. We're actually closed," she said, turning around with a polite, tired smile. The Purity radiance was dimmer now, exhausted by the day, but still beautiful. "I know," Arthur said. He moved with the sudden jerking speed of a striking viper. He closed the distance in 2 strides. Before she could scream, before her brain could even process the threat, the taser in his hand crackled against her neck. She fell. Arthur caught her before she hit the floor. He held her gently, almost reverently. He didn't drag her. He carried her out the back exit, placing her into the trunk of his car as if she were a fragile porcelain doll. Efficiency, precision, purity. 3 days later, Arthur stood in his study, a glass of water in his hand. This room was the heart of the sanctuary. One wall was covered in cork, pinned with photographs. They were beautiful. 23 faces stared back at him, frozen in their final moments of innocence. Under each photo was a small label, typed on a typewriter. Subject 12, 76%. Subject 18, 82%. And now, right in the center, Subject 24, 88%. He looked at Sarah's picture. She looked peaceful. He had saved her. She would never lie, never steal, never grow old and bitter. She was perfect forever. A scream tore through the silence. Arthur dropped his glass. It shattered, water soaking into the expensive rug. The scream had come from the hallway, It was wet, gurgling, and unmistakably feminine. It sounded like air forcing its way through a throat filled with fluid. Arthur drew the suppressed pistol from his desk drawer in one fluid motion. He moved to the door, pressing his back against the frame. He listened. Silence. Intruder? Impossible? The perimeter alarms hadn't triggered. A squatter? He swept the hallway, weapon raised, empty. He checked the operating theater, empty. The restraints were clean. The incinerator was cold. Arthur lowered the gun, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He rubbed his temples. Sleep deprivation, he diagnosed. Auditory hallucination caused by stress and 72 hours of hyperfocus. I need rest. He turned back toward the study. In the corner of his eye, just at the periphery of his vision, he saw it. A figure, standing by the coat rack. It was tall, gray, and its head was twisted at an impossible angle. Arthur whipped his head around, gun raised. Nothing. Just the coat rack and his own trench coat hanging limply. "Stop it," he hissed at himself. His voice sounded thin in the empty building. "You are a man of logic. Acts of imagination are beneath you." He grabbed his coat. He couldn't stay here tonight. The air felt too thick, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. He needed his apartment, his clean, modern, sterile apartment in the city. The drive home was a blur of paranoia. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror looked like eyes. Every shadow on the street corner looked like a broken limb. Arthur reached his apartment building, a high-end complex, with a doorman and enough security to feel protected, enough as he slept. He rode the elevator to the penthouse, the silence of the lift soothing his frayed nerves. He reached his door. He inserted the key. Thump, thump, thump. Arthur froze. The sound came from inside his apartment. Distinct, heavy footsteps. Someone was pacing in his living room. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. But almost immediately, his analytical mind clamped down on it. Police? No. If the police had found him, they would be waiting in the lobby with a SWAT team, not pacing his living room. A burglar? Good, Arthur thought, a grim smile touching his lips. A burglar is biological matter. A burglar can be broken. He unlocked the door and threw it open, leveling his pistol. "Don't move," he shouted, stepping into the foyer. The apartment was dark, illuminated only by the city lights, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The footsteps stopped. "I said show yourself," Arthur barked. He moved tactically, clearing the corners. Kitchen clear, dining area clear. He looked toward the living room. The footsteps started again. Thump, thump, thump. They were coming from the center of the rug, directly in front of him. But there was no one there. Arthur stared at the empty space, his brain misfiring. The sound was distinct leather soles on hardwood, but the visual data was zero. "Who are you?" he whispered, the gun shaking in his hand. The footsteps stopped 3 feet away from him. The air pressure in the room plummeted. Arthur's ears popped. The fine hairs on his neck stood rigid. And then he was hit. It wasn't a ghostly chill. It was a kinetic impact, like a linebacker slamming into his chest. Arthur flew backward. His feet left the ground. He smashed into the hallway wall, the breath driven from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. The gun skittered across the floor. He slumped against the plaster, gasping for air. staring wide-eyed at the empty living room. Physics, his mind screamed, desperately trying to clutch at straws. Shockwave? Impossible. Magnetic repulsion? No. Something picked up the glass coffee table, a heavy 100-pound slab of glass, and hurled it at him. Arthur rolled to the side. The table shattered against the wall where his head had been a second ago, showering him in razor-sharp shards. This wasn't a hallucination. This was force. This was rage. Arthur scrambled to his feet, ignoring the glass slicing his palms. He fumbled for the door handle, threw it open, and stumbled out into the corridor. He didn't wait for the elevator. He sprinted for the stairwell. He burst through the fire door, his breath coming in ragged tears. He grabbed the railing, ready to hurl himself down the stairs to the lobby, to the street, to anywhere with people and lights. He looked down. On the landing below, standing perfectly still in the gloom, was a woman. Arthur stopped, his momentum nearly sending him over the railing. She was wearing a tattered red dress. Her skin was gray, translucent, glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. But Arthur recognized her. He knew every inch of her anatomy. Subject 4, the teacher. He had removed her teeth. He remembered doing it. The figure below looked up. Her mouth opened, revealing a black, empty maw. She began to float up the stairs. She didn't walk. Her feet dragged uselessly behind her, the ankles broken, just as he had left them. She drifted toward him with a terrible, inevitable slowness. Arthur scrambled back, whimpering. He looked up. The roof. The only way was up. He ran. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his lungs burning, his mind fracturing. Behind him, he could hear a sound like wind howling through a tunnel, a chorus of whispers, of cries, of pleas for mercy. He burst onto the rooftop, the heavy steel door slamming open against the brickwork. Rain lashed at his face. The wind howled, whipping his coat around his legs. Arthur stumbled into the center of the gravel roof, spinning around, searching for an escape. There was nowhere to go, just the edge and the drop. The door to the stairwell creaked. Arthur backed away, holding his hands up as if to ward off a blow. "Stay back," he shouted. "You're dead. You're data. You're just data." They poured out of the doorway. It wasn't just the teacher. It was all of them. Subject 12, holding his own severed fingers. Subject 18, the skin of his chest flayed open. Sarah, the baker, her neck twisted at a sharp angle, her eyes wide and white. They were a legion of gray, ruined things. They didn't run. They didn't scream. They simply flowed onto the roof like a tide of misery, a wall of spiritual sludge, moving to reclaim its creator. Arthur backed up. His heels crunched on the gravel. "I saved you," he screamed, the logic finally snapping, spilling his madness out into the open. "You were impure. I made you perfect." The horde advanced. The air grew freezing cold. The rain turned to ice. Arthur took another step back. His heel found nothing but air. He flailed, his arms windmilling. But gravity was a law that even he could not argue with. He tipped backward over the low parapet. For a split second, as he hung suspended between the roof and the abyss, he saw his reflection in the dark glass of the penthouse window. His ability, his curse, activated one last time. The number floated above his own terrified, screaming face in the reflection. 0%. The god in the sandbox. Water. John rasped. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. "Please, I just need a sip." The figure across the metal table didn't move. The interrogation room was stark, smelling of ammonia and old coffee. A single bulb buzzed overhead, swinging slightly in a draft John couldn't feel. The light cast long, swinging shadows, keeping the detective's face permanently obscured in a silhouette of darkness. John didn't care about the detective's face. He cared about the silence. "You have to listen to me," John said, leaning forward. The handcuffs clattered against the table. "You can't send a beat cop. You can't send a social worker. You need to send a strike team. You need to plug their ears with wax. If he speaks, you lose. If he asks a question, you lose." The detective remained motionless, a void in the shape of a man. A pen scratched against paper in the gloom. Scritch, scratch, start from the beginning. The shadow said. The voice was low, garbled by the acoustics of the room. John swallowed dryly. "His name is Toby. He's 7 years old, and he has never been told no. It started when he was 3. John whispered, his eyes unfocused, drifting back to the nightmare. "We thought he was just a persuasive kid. He'd ask for a cookie, and you'd feel this compulsion, not fear. Joy." John looked at his trembling hands. "That's the part nobody understands. That's why nobody runs away when he sleeps. When you obey him, it's like a shot of pure heroin. It's warm honey pouring over your brain. You feel complete. You feel a sense of purpose, so absolute, it makes you weep." He shuddered. "And when you aren't doing something for him, it's withdrawal. It's the cold shakes. You sit by his bed while he sleeps, shivering, praying he wakes up and asks for a glass of water, just so you can feel that high again." "We were junkies," John said, a tear tracking through the grime on his cheek. "And he was the needle. But children grow," John continued, his voice dropping to a terrified hush. "Children are curious. They want to learn." John looked up at the shadow, pleading for understanding. "Most kids learn by being corrected. Toby learned by consumption. He realized early on that nobody could lie to him. Nobody could simplify things for him. If he asked, 'Why is the sky blue?' you didn't give him the toddler answer. You were forced, compelled by his will to explain the physics of Rayleigh's scattering. You couldn't help it. You poured your entire intellect into him. He absorbed it all," John said. By 5, he knew anatomy because he asked a surgeon to explain how people break. By 6, he knew psychology because he asked his mother why she was crying. John choked back a sob. He asked her, "Why are you sad, Mommy?" She told him the truth. She told him she was sad because she was a slave in her own home. She told him she wanted to die. John squeezed his eyes shut. So, being a helpful boy, he told her, "Then you should do it." The silence in the interrogation room was deafening. He watched her. John whispered. He watched her do it with the same curiosity a kid has when he pulls the legs off a spider. He didn't understand the tragedy. He just understood the mechanism. Cause and effect. Order and obedience. "I got out yesterday," John said, looking at the mirrored glass on the wall, seeing his own gaunt, haunted reflection. "I broke his favorite toy, a model train. It was an accident. I was shaking from withdrawal." He looked at me. His eyes, they aren't a child's eyes anymore. They are ancient, cold. He screamed at me. He screamed, "You are useless. I hate you. Go away. I never want to see you again." John let out a hysterical, broken laugh. The command was absolute. Go away. My body moved before I could think. I walked out the front door. I walked until my feet bled, and the further I got, the more the fog lifted. The command to go away inadvertently pushed me out of his radius. John slammed his hands on the table. "I'm the first one to escape the bliss. That's why I'm here. That's why you need to kill him. He's not a child. He's a singularity. If he decides he wants to know what a nuclear explosion looks like, he just has to ask the right person." John sat back, panting. "That's the truth. That's the whole story. Now please, call the military. Call the SWAT team." The detective stopped writing. The scratching sound ceased. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the shadow spoke. "That was a very detailed testimony, John." John frowned. The voice. It wasn't the low, garbled baritone anymore. It was higher, clearer. "But," the voice continued, "you missed a plot hole." John squinted into the dark. "What? If you walked away because I told you to," the voice said, sounding petulant now. "Then why are you sitting in this chair?" The hum of the overhead light changed pitch. It shifted from a buzz to a melody, a nursery rhyme. The lighting in the room flickered. The shadows didn't retreat. They dissolved. The gray concrete walls of the interrogation room melted away like wet paint. The one-way mirror rippled and transformed into a wall covered in crayon drawings of monsters. The cold metal table under John's hands softened, turning into bright blue plastic. John looked down. He wasn't handcuffed. He was tied to a tiny plastic chair with a jump rope. He looked up. There was no detective. Sitting across from him at the tea party table was a boy with blonde hair and eyes that held the depth of an abyss. Toby wore superhero pajamas. He was holding a crayon, not a pen. "We weren't playing cops and robbers, Daddy," Toby said, looking disappointed. "We were playing interrogation. I wanted to know what you would do if you thought you were free. I wanted the truth." John's mind shattered. The illusion had been perfect. The walk, the police station, the coffee smell. It was all a mental projection, a hallucination forced into his brain by a bored god. The bliss came rushing back, hitting John like a sledgehammer. The desire to serve, the love, the horror. Toby tapped the crayon against his chin, looking thoughtful. A cruel reptilian intelligence sharpened his gaze. "That was a fun story, though," Toby said, sliding off his chair. He walked around the table and placed a small hand on John's trembling shoulder. "Especially the ending." Toby smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Daddy, what is a SWAT team?" John tried to scream, but his mouth snapped shut of its own accord. "And," Toby whispered, leaning in close, "can I meet them?" The cycle of shadows. She was smiling. Not a happy smile, but one born from relief. A sense of liberation. The sharp tip of her knife gleamed faintly in the moonlight, blood still fresh on its edge. Her ex had finally paid for what he did, for the terrible end of their relationship. She remembered the moment vividly, the anger, the betrayal, the torment. And then, the blade, her blade, pierced through his chest, ending it all. She had felt the weight lift from her shoulders, the finality sealing her vengeance. Now, standing in the rain while waiting for the bus, she looked down at the memory of his lifeless body. her heart pounding with a strange mixture of satisfaction and madness. She barely registered the cold drops soaking her hair and skin. She was free, free from the past, from her pain, from him. Her eyes flicked to the shadows in the distance. A man, someone who looked familiar. Not her ex exactly, but close enough. His face was blurred, distorted by the rain and her own trembling mind. She felt a flicker of curiosity. No, obsession, and her lips curled into a sinister smile. "Finally," she whispered, voice trembling with excitement. "Time to finish the job." The man was just returning home. His house sat on the edge of the city, nestled near a dense patch of woods that stretched out like dark veins beneath the pale moon. It was late, and the rain hammered down relentlessly, turning the narrow street into a slick, shimmering mirror. He hurried under his umbrella, nerves prickling paranoia, maybe. Ever since he reported the weird woman chasing him through the woods one day, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced back, heart pounding as a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. Was it her, or just his mind playing tricks? The police never found her, as he remembers only her voice, shouting, frantic, wild. He tried to convince himself she was gone, that she was just a ghost of his paranoia. But tonight something felt different. A figure darted between the trees. It was her, frantic, desperate, eyes wild with obsession. She saw him, and her face twisted with frantic determination. Without hesitation, she began to pursue him, her footsteps pounding into the muddy earth, rain turning her movements into streaks of shadow. He sprinted toward his house at first, but quickly realized he should not show her where he lives. Panic rising as she closed the distance, he decided to try and lose her in the woods. His mind raced. Was she really alive? Or just a hallucination? But her voice cut through the rain-sharp, piercing, unrecognizable. "You can't run from me," she screamed, voice cracking. The chase drew her deeper into the cold forest, where rain hammered like drums. She moved with a hunter's purpose, every breath a razor against the storm, every footfall a vow to end what gnawed at her. The trail twisted through trunks slick with rain, between roots that clutched at her ankles. She pressed on, driven by the memory of the blade's cold kiss, and the imagined clap of applause that would rise in her mind when her hands would once again taste his blood. Then the world betrayed her. The ground softened to mud, the earth slipping away as if reluctant to let her pass. Branches clawed at her skin as she descended a slope that seemed to narrow with each step. The trees loomed closer as she searched for him, branches like skeletal fingers closing in, and she thought she could hear the river's distant roar. She pressed forward, but the ground betrayed her once more. The world folded into a green-black blur of bark and stone, and then it opened to air that tasted of iron and rain. She fell through a tangle of branches and stones, the world turning into a brutal, vertical slide. He was close, and saw her as she tumbled down. The river caught her and threw her into its mouth, a tumbling, merciless plunge that did not care for fear or anger or the vow she whispered to the night. The current seized her, threw her down, dragged her across stones slick with spray, carried her like a warning to those who would chase a shadow. She fought the river with a strength that felt borrowed from some darker part of herself. And finally the water spit her out with a brutal clean splash, flinging her downstream where the world narrowed again into the cold, unfeeling dark. As he saw her fall to what he could only describe as fatal injuries caused by madness and a relentless pursuit, he exited the woods he knew as the back of his palms and returned home, thinking to himself that he can finally relax. Even so, he slept with the blinds drawn, listening for footsteps that never came, and every creak of the hallway sounded to him like a second syllable in a story he wished he could unread. A week passed, with the city's rain renewing the streets and dulling the ache behind his eyes. Then, as if the river's memory had whispered back into the night, she appeared again to start a new chase, one that she would not lose this time, she told herself. With too much panic, he went straight for his house, thinking he might be able to dissuade her once he reaches his house and closes his door before she can reach him. He reached the porch, fumbling with his keys, heart pounding so loud he thought it would burst out of his chest. She was close now, frantic, her figure blurred by the rain and darkness. He threw open the door and slammed it shut behind him, locking it tight. Inside his house, trembling, he listened. He heard her voice, shouting, cursing, calling his name. But there was something off. The voice was wrong, distorted, as if echoing. His eyes darted around, searching for her, but she was nowhere to be seen. He slowly moved to the window, peering out at the dark woods. The rain continued to pour, thunder rumbling in the distance. He felt his stomach tighten. Was she still out there? Or was it all in his head? Suddenly, the crash of a heavy object was heard smashing into one of the windows, and he turned to look, only to see a figure appeared in the doorway, faster than his reflexes could process. She was there, eyes wide, frantic, holding a knife. Her face was streaked with rain and dirt, her expression unhinged. "I finally have you," she yelled. She lunged at him. The fight, if you could even call it that, was brief. He barely had time to react before she slashed at his throat. Blood sprayed across the porch as he clutched his neck. Gasping, his vision blurred, and as he looked at her, her wild eyes, her manic smile, his face seemed different, as if his features flickered, distorted, revealing the horrifying truth. He never truly looked like her ex. It was all in her head, a hallucination born from her madness. He collapsed, blood pooling on the porch, but the smile remained on her face. She laughed, a high, manic sound, and then she turned away, disappearing into the rain. From her perspective, she walked down the street, her steps unsteady, but determined. She looked back once more, her eyes falling on a man across the street. He was watching her, a faint resemblance to her ex, or perhaps just another illusion. Her obsession renewed, her mind slipping into the cycle again.
Did you like this chapter? More are on the way. If you want to keep up with the story next time it releases, don't forget to subscribe. And if you have the means and the time, consider buying me a coffee.